Back in late December, just before Christmas, there was a little boy in Cornwall, England, named Alex Nash, and he was invited to a birthday party for a fellow child. There was another child at the school that he attended, and he received an invitation. Now, this is kind of a neat special invitation. It was a party that was at the Plymouth Ski and Snowboard Center, more of a kind of a bunny hill than anything else, but a place where you could have a birthday party for your children. And Alex was invited, and he agreed to go. He talked to his father, and his father said it was okay to go. So he was all excited. And then, as time got on towards the party, his father remembered that he had committed Alex to be at his grandparents' house that day. So he tried to get hold of this person who was hosting the party, but couldn't find the invitation. I know I had that same experience myself. And he felt bad because poor Alex had to miss this birthday party. Well, a couple of weeks ago, Alex comes home from school, and there is this note, this brown paper envelope in his school bag. His dad looks in his school bag, and there's this brown paper note in the school bag. And in that envelope is an invoice from Alex's classmate's mother. It's $16 that he owes them. It's a no-show fee for not coming to the party. And Mr. Nash said, it was a proper invoice with full official details and even her bank details, like her bank account number, so that he could deposit the money that he should have given her. He said, I can understand that she's upset about losing money. The money isn't the issue. It's the way that she went about trying to get the money from me. Putting a note in his kid's bag at school. Now, the mother of Alex's classmate isn't happy with the fact that she hasn't been paid yet, and she is suing him in small claims court, if you can believe this. This is crazy. She claims that young Alex, at 5 years old, entered into a verbal contract to go to the party, and that he violated the terms of his verbal contract, and now he has to pay this invoice. Now, this is something that started out as a gift, and now it becomes a billable purchase order. It would all be kind of laughable if it weren't so sad. The Bible tells us to receive the kingdom of God like a child. Can you see how that philosophy might have been a little helpful in Alex's situation? What does the Bible mean? What does Jesus mean when he says that we should receive the kingdom of God like a child? This morning I want to challenge you to think again about what we mean when we say that we're living in God's kingdom, even though 7 days a week you and I are living in the real world. How do we go back to having a childlike faith? Can we talk about maturing in our faith and at the same time talking about having a childlike faith? Is that a contradiction? Is a childlike faith but also be growing and maturing in faith? I want you to think about what you've seen this morning and ask yourself if there's something we can learn from our children. Is there something that we've seen this morning as our children share their faith and talents with us that we might take for our own faith journey? That story that Melissa read for us this morning, in that story, Jesus' followers, they don't think that there's anything they have to learn from children. The only one that they're going to learn anything from is Jesus in their hearts. Now, as you read the Gospel of Mark, you see Jesus in this part of the Gospel teaching 12 followers what it means to be part of God's kingdom. That's a funny way of saying that God reigns all over the world, that God is the king of the world. What does it mean to be in God's kingdom? Now, these guys were not experts in religion. They didn't come from a highly educated background, most of them. But Jesus teaches them day after day, one lesson after another, one human situation after another. He teaches them the way that the teacher teaches students. He instructs them. He corrects them. He demonstrates. He encourages. He discourages. And then they go out and they try to do what he does. And sometimes, they do it, and sometimes they do it wrong, and sometimes he has to go and show them what they did wrong so that they can do it right the next time. That's what Jesus looks like with his disciples in this portion of Mark's Gospel. But after a while, these guys are convinced that they are leaders. They think that they're management material. And they didn't have to treat anybody who was beneath them with any respect. Now, the chapter previous to the one that we read, they were having this brilliant argument over which one of them was the greatest disciple of all. I mean, can you imagine us having a discussion over a fellowship hall over coffee over which one of us is the best Baptist of all? How well would that discussion go, right? You picture that argument with these guys? I'm the greatest disciple. I did this, or Jesus did this for me. Jesus decides that he's going to teach them a lesson about what it really means to be great. Back in that society, women and children were not highly valued. They were at the bottom of the food chain in that society. Boys were somewhat valued because having a boy in your family ensured the continuation of the family line. That was the way that the laws were written. And if you continue the family line, then you continue your family property. In that society, men held almost all of the power, and women and children were at their disposal. So, while Jesus' disciples are arguing about who's more important than the others, Jesus asks a child to sit down with him. And he says to them, whoever welcomes such a child in my name, welcomes me. Now that's kind of upside down from what they were used to. They were used to thinking that children were of any importance. It was the opposite of their upbringing. They thought that children should be welcoming them, should be taking care of them, showing them respect, not the other way around. The disciples thought that they were the top of the food chain since they were adult men. And now they're supposed to show deference to children? I mean, it didn't make any sense. Nobody else was saying stuff like this. No other teachers were making those kinds of remarks. What is Jesus talking about? In today's story, Jesus is teaching, and he gets to that same subject again. He's busy teaching, and at the end of the lesson, when he's done with his lesson, people started bringing their children to Jesus, wanting him to bless them. You see, back then, people believed that if a devout religious figure like a priest or a prophet or a teacher were to lay their hands on a child, that touching of hands would give that child divine power. They also believed that somebody like Jesus, revered as he was, thought of as a prophet by the people, had the power to call God's blessing down on a child. So you can imagine that when somebody like Jesus comes to town, people will be wanting him to bless their children. But when people bring their kids up to Jesus and they're wanting him to do all this blessing, the disciples get upset with them. They had studied hard. They had made sacrifices in their own lives, and they had earned in their minds access to Jesus. And they didn't want to just have other people get free access to Jesus. These people just wanted to give their children God's blessing. But the disciples thought that they were more important than the children. Jesus should spend his time and his strength giving to them, not giving to children. The disciples start getting in the way, and they start pushing people back and say, hey, leave them alone. There's no free access here, folks. They start laying into these parents for presuming that Jesus would even want to deal with their children. He's too important. And Jesus sees them, and he just lets his disciples have it. He demands that the disciples allow the parents to bring their children to him. Stop getting in the way. Bring the kids to me. I am accessible to them. Why are you stopping them? He says. He says, don't try to ration me. My time isn't something that you get to dispense to other people. God's kingdom is for everybody. It's not just for you. It never everybody teach you to share? At this point, Jesus was up to here with his disciples and their selfishness. He's tired of them acting as though they are his executive vice presidents. He tells everybody that the kingdom of God belongs to people like these children, like our children this morning. Well, that's all good and nice, but how are a bunch of children going to run God's kingdom? I mean, doesn't that statement sound a little bit ridiculous? In the disciples' minds, it was saying like we're going to have our melody makers replace the executive committee and let them run things for a while. I mean, can you picture how that's going to go over? What would it look like if one of them served as the moderator or board chair? I can almost guarantee a motion to allow running in the halls without any parental intervention. Jesus finishes dressing down his disciples by saying that anybody who doesn't enter God's kingdom as a child will never enter it. There's been a big debate over what he meant when he talked about entering God's kingdom as a child. And I remember when I was a kid, and it was Kids' Day at the church when I was growing up, people said that that meant we had to have a childlike faith in Jesus and his teachings. That we needed to have a willing acceptance of what we were being taught at church. That we were willing to accept without a lot of argument what we were being taught. And that was entering the kingdom of God like a child. I'm not sure about that interpretation. I think there's a lot of parents who wish that their kids were simply accepting of what they were told. But you and I know that's not the case. That's not how it works. Children dismiss what their parents are telling them all the time. So I don't think he's talking about an unquestioning acceptance of what we teach here at church. I think the real significance of what he's saying is that children accept God's salvation and teachings and grace as a gift from God. They have no right to it. They haven't earned Jesus' love with good behavior. Their status in society doesn't entitle them to it. It's simply a gift that they have received. Now I want you to contrast that attitude with the attitude of the disciples. They're saying to themselves, we earned it. We worked our way up God's corporate ladder. We're the head honchos now. Jesus is saying, no, you're not. You're not entitled to God's grace. It is a gift that God gave to you just like God gave it to everybody else. These kids have figured out that it's a gift. How is it that you guys still haven't figured it out? This passage reminds us that regardless of how far up we may think we are in God's kingdom, we need to continue entering it as children. And this passage has a couple of things to teach us about that. First, I think we all need to work on being more welcoming of children if we're going to be successful in entering God's kingdom like one. I can't express how proud I am of our congregation for the way that they have responded to the challenge of caring for the children of our GED students. A couple of weeks ago, one of the girls, probably a first or second grade girl, was trying to do her homework in the nursery on a Wednesday night. There were a bunch of other kids in the nursery. She was having trouble concentrating with all the commotion and the noise. So one of our caregivers asked her if she wanted to go to another room and sit down and do her homework. That caregiver took her to the library, sat down with her. She did her homework in peace. Last week I was talking with one of the mothers before class. Her son always has this hard time being separated from her when she drops him off in class. When she walks out the door of the nursery to go to class, it sounds like this boy's lid is being ripped off. He screams so loud. I talked to her the other night, and she says that he's doing a lot better now. She says that he's getting used to the people in the nursery because the folks in the nursery have done such a good job that that class is really growing. There are now too many people going to that class to fit in the media room. Can you see how welcoming children can absolutely be a game changer for a congregation? We are slowly building the trust of the Mexican community here in Peoria. We're building a reputation, a rapport that will help us grow. And children. Now, I know that sometimes working with children at church can feel like more than a burden than an investment in the future of the church. But we need to change that whole vibe if we want to convince more young families to bring their children here. The other thing this passage teaches us is that we sometimes forget God's salvation is a gift to us. Sometimes we get a little off track, especially when we've been involved in a number of ministries here at church. And we start to think that maybe, I've earned it. I've put in my time. We say to ourselves, this little voice that says, God chose me because I decided to change my life and do what's right in God's eyes. That's the fallacy that the disciples started to take on in chapter 9 and 10. That's what caused them to start arguing about which one of them was the best disciple. This passage teaches us that we have not earned God's grace any more than these children have. They realize that all they have in their lives is given to them. They don't have the money to go out and buy things. They can't sign a loan on a house or a car. They don't have good parents because they are inherently better than the other kid who was born to terrible parents or who only have one. Everything that they have is given to them. That's simply the nature of their existence at this age. I want you to think about how humbling that has to be. Think of how powerless they are in many ways. Jesus is saying to us, that's where you all are in terms of God's kingdom. You have what you have because God has given it to you. You are as powerless as a child to control God's kingdom or determine your role in it. The only way to live in God's kingdom is to accept what God has given you with that level of humility. Our kids are willing to do that. Jesus is challenging us to ask ourselves, why is it so hard for us to do the same? I heard a story this week about a pastor who had a very young son, and his son was still old enough to be in the nursery at church. During one Sunday morning, they were worshiping, and his son was in the nursery, and he needed to go and use the restroom. So he asked the nursery attendant to let him go to the bathroom. And when he finished, he must have figured out some way to sneak out of the bathroom past whomever was in the nursery. He was having trouble tying his shoe after he was going to the bathroom, but he heard his father's voice coming over the PA system throughout the church. So he followed his dad's voice and eventually walked into the sanctuary where his father was in the middle of the sermon. And keep in mind that this little boy still had not pulled his pants up from using the bathroom. The congregation must have been gripped with whatever the pastor was saying because that little boy walked all the way up to the front of the church and looked up at his father in the pulpit. I was just picturing myself in the situation as I'm reading the story. I would have been mortified. I just imagining what the next church board meeting was going to be. The pastor stopped in the middle of his sermon. He looked down at his son and he said, "What do you need, son?" The boy looked up at his father and said, "I can't tie my shoe, Dad." The pastor bent down in front of everyone and pulled up his son's pants and tied his shoe and had somebody take him back to the nursery. And when he was done with that, he went on with his sermon. Now, I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts that no one in that church could tell you for the life of them what that sermon was about. But I'm sure that none of them will ever see a better illustration of what Jesus meant when he said, "Let the little children come unto me." The kingdom of heaven belongs to people like them. Today we celebrate their presence with us. I can't tell you how happy I am to hear those kids sing and play the piano. But I can't tell you how happy they are to be able to do it. As adults, we try to set an example of how we want them to live when they grow up. We try to teach them what it means to be godly, hoping that someday they're going to go out and put it to practice in their own lives. That's why we teach them Sunday school. That's why we have melody makers. That's why we have Easter egg hunts. It's why we have Vacation Bible School. It's why I hope we can start a weekly or monthly children's ministry. At the same time, this experience today reminds us that they still have much to teach us. Their humility pulls us down off of our high horses, reminds us that we have received God's grace as a gift just as they did. They remind us to enter God's kingdom the way that a child does. They remind us that Jesus still blesses us the way that he blessed children that day. And that our children are one of the greatest blessings that we could have ever received.